Welcome back to the Nobody Knows Nothing podcast. This is episode number 3, The Inversion. The mind of conspiracy ideation and the will to believe. There's a saying from the East, when a student is ready, the teacher will appear. I met a teacher who changed my life, but this story isn't like other stories you might have heard about teachers, because my greatest teacher was a fool. I've tried to write this story a dozen times over the years, but each time I've tried to avoid specifically picking on any one group, idea, or culture. But in the end, young Earth creationism is the most visible and outright obvious example of willful ignorance in my personal experience. More than a decade ago, atheists of the New Atheist movement spent their time debating creationists. The movement obsessed over the spectacle of debate. The highlight of the moment was probably when Bill Nye, the science guy, debated the founder of the Creation Museum, Answers in Genesis, and the Ark Encounter, Ken Ham. In Kentucky, there's a quasi-museum theme park that promotes biblically literalist version of history, where the Earth is only a few thousand years old and dinosaurs and humans live together. Answers in Genesis is one of the many organizations that exist to create doubts about science in order to make room for their particular worldview. The guy I knew who became my greatest teacher was a young Earth creationist who embraced Ken Ham's portrayal of science. He was a young, energetic, and charismatic preacher for a local church. Hilariously, we looked similar enough in appearance that his elderly church members would often get us confused for each other. I had politely heard complaints from his congregants more than a few times. For all of his faults, he was trying to be a good person, but the drowning cannot hold back the sea. In the previous episode, we discussed how people go wrong when they attempt to apply skepticism. It's common to jump to conclusions about what evidence implies, or for someone to fail to accurately infer the implications of the weight of evidence. Both of these approaches aid an individual in subconsciously denying knowledge. In this episode, we'll discuss the rhetorical styles and tactics used by media networks, politicians, influencers, and even between individuals in public debate. This episode will be slightly different from the previous episodes in that I'm giving a lot more of my own personal thoughts, and by necessity, our conversation will cross into territory some people might be uncomfortable with. 2 + 2 = 5. What is knowledge denial? George Orwell wrote the dystopian fiction of 1984, wherein a society becomes so constantly propagandized that they accept total authoritarian control over their lives. Orwell's story is probably one of the most well-known dystopian political novels of the last century, so much so that the label Orwellian is commonly used to describe authoritarian surveillance by people who have no familiarity with the original story. When I was a teenager, I despised it. Spoiler, it does not have a happy ending. It took somebody way smarter than me to convince me to think of it differently. The dark ending was the point of the novel. Totalitarianism, once it has acquired the ability to make people believe 2 + 2 = 5, might be almost impossible to stop. As the bad guy says, if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. In the last episode, I mentioned the philosopher René Descartes. He's the guy behind the famous "I think, therefore I am." And that quote is Descartes trying to reason his way through a big philosophy problem called the problem of mind-body dualism. There's a lot to unpack with philosophy problems, but the relevant parts are that philosophers have struggled with trying to explain whether our experiences of reality are reality itself, or just our minds experiencing reality. Modern neuroscience reveals that our individual experiences of the same reality are often very different. Do you remember the viral internet blue-black dress versus white-gold dress? The same picture of a two-tone dress was shared across social media, but viewers reported seeing entirely different colors, even though the pictures were the exact same. Some reported a blue dress with black lace, others reported seeing a white dress with gold lace. The internet went crazy for a few days arguing over what color the dress really was in actual reality. A close friend refused to speak to me for a week because they insisted I was gaslighting them about what colors I saw in the dress photo. Later, a saved copy of the photo appeared to me different than it had before. Even I thought I was going crazy. It turns out the same phenomenon has been observed elsewhere. People really were seeing the same object but perceiving it as almost completely opposite colors. Our brains are primed by other things before we ever encounter the picture, and that priming will determine how our minds experience it. It's crazy, but just the lighting in the room around someone who is viewing the image can wildly change how they see the colors in the photograph. This is a great example of a phenomenon of the brain and the way that we all see reality. The human brain is the most complex object in the universe, really. The thing is, there's a lot going on up there. Processing all of that stuff is burdensome, so the mind uses shortcuts. The brain takes in cues from our surroundings and tries to fill in the blanks in how we experience reality. It is well understood that the mind fills in these blanks for missing information. In the early 1900s, scientists discovered that even though limited information is perceived by our sensory perceptions, the mind often fills in missing information to give us a whole picture. Neuroscientists talk about the human brain being great at pattern detection. Evolutionarily, it is safer for a mind to assume an unknown noise in the dark might be another entity, another mind. The noise might be a lion in the long grass that's thinking about eating us. It's safer to jump to conclusions and to let your imagination loose and run away. The same stands true today. If you hear a noise in the darkness, your mind fills in the blanks and says, "That doesn't fit. Maybe I'd better go the other way and avoid finding out what it is." It is evolutionarily safer to assume the bumps in the night really are the demons that your mind creates. Pattern recognition of this type is one of the many examples of the mind using shortcuts to deal with the complexity of the things going on in reality. The mind sees pieces, and then it assembles its own version of the whole picture before compiling more details, because this way, it's faster to react to potential threats. An interesting example of built-in cognitive shortcuts comes in the form of pareidolia. Pareidolia is the phenomenon where the mind picks out the pattern of faces, even in places where there's not a real face. People spot faces on all sorts of stuff. Many cultures saw patterns of people and faces on the surface of the moon. That's where the phrase, "the man in the moon," comes from. People have seen faces in smoke, in the clouds, even on food. In art design, Gestalt theory teaches artists to use these same principles of how the mind interprets patterns to work to their advantage in their artwork. Our minds are eager to fill in some blanks. We're more likely to interpret some types of patterns in ways we might not immediately be conscious of. Most of the time, this is entirely harmless. Imagery and symbols can become more than their individual parts. It's just part of how the mind works. These ideas are not controversial, and none of these on their own is malicious. Art students are not plotting to take over the world. Well, Hitler doesn't count because he failed to get into art school. With the right type of knowledge, priming can intentionally lead an audience towards specific mental shortcuts. You've likely seen mentalists or stage magicians use some of the same techniques in public performances. It's about targeted distraction. Advertising has learned to use the fact that you're more likely to look one way than the other and to use that to its advantage. Even that on its own isn't necessarily malicious. Consider this. If our minds are constantly being redirected in ways we don't perceive, allowing us to ignore parts of the picture we might not know we are missing, how would we have any way of knowing unless someone else pointed it out to us? We see what we expect to see, and in cases of minds primed for cognitive dissonance, they won't see what they've been primed not to see. The mind sees what it expects to see, but not necessarily what's really there. In the beginning of this episode, I mentioned that my greatest teacher was a young Earth creationist pastor. We worked together, so we were stuck together. He was very committed to convincing me that the theory of evolution was wrong. We talked about creationism and science in almost every way the conversation could be had. He would challenge me with creationist talking points, and I would do my best to explain how they missed the science. Young Earth creationist groups, individuals, and institutions sell books and host seminars for fundamentalists who want to challenge non-believers like me. I'm not an expert in biology. I really didn't know nearly as much about evolution going in as I learned through addressing the objections that came from his creationist seminars, influencers, and books. For me, the important part was more about laying stress on the particulars of using the scientific method and how it differed in thinking from the methods of young Earth creationist pseudoscience. There was constant back and forth over minute details of different sciences, with me doing my best to explain how scientific reasoning works across disciplines. He told me once that he had difficulty trusting science because it's always changing its mind. I explained that it's sort of the point of science, learning how to change your mind when you find out you were wrong about an idea. When you admit your understanding was wrong, you're free to change it to match new information. If you fail to admit your error out of pride or bias, you're stuck believing in a falsehood and there's nowhere to go. The scientific method succeeds by seeking out those errors and demanding we change our mind when we find them. Unlike other ways of thinking about the world, science doesn't ask us to believe out of faith. It does the opposite. It demands we seek reasons to justify our beliefs and change our minds when we discover that we're wrong. That was more than a decade ago, but one conversation one day in particular has stuck in my mind. Most of our interactions always began after he'd found a new book series or YouTube video about how to challenge secular science people. My friend confidently told me that he couldn't believe in evolution because it required more faith to believe in evolution than it did to believe in creationism. He said that nobody could ever take a picture of the Big Bang because nobody was there to witness it. He told me that Darwin's predictions of transitional species were wrong because there's never been a single example of a transitional species discovered in the fossil record. I'm going to admit to my listeners, I'm a huge fan of dinosaurs and paleohistory. I'm a major nerd, and even as a kid, I always knew that I wanted to decorate my house with toy dinosaurs and replicas of famous fossils. I just so happen to have an exact replica of a fossil discovered in the 1870s outside of Berlin. It's a spectacular fossil of an animal called Archaeopteryx. What makes the Archaeopteryx unique is that it had features of both reptiles and birds. It's also famously the first example of a transitional species discovered in the fossil record. Darwin predicted that the fossil record would eventually vindicate his ideas. Archaeopteryx was discovered during his lifetime, and Darwin was aware of it. That was like the 1870s, and since that time, there have been thousands of examples discovered of what Darwin described as transitional species. In my personal collection, I had this very nice, full-size replica of the first transitional species. So I grabbed this fossil replica, a few books with details about Archaeopteryx, and a book on modern astronomy, and I bring them back to work and I show all of this to my friend during our break. I pointed out in the astronomy book that the leftover radiation from the Big Bang is still observable at any time for someone who might care to investigate. And an image of the cosmic microwave background is, in fact, a type of picture of the Big Bang. I gave him a thorough rundown of the fossil, and I pointed out how it had features of both birds and reptiles. I explained how Archaeopteryx is a perfect example of a transitional species. He listened carefully until the end, and for a moment it looked like he was really considering what he'd just learned. Then, in an instant, I saw something I'd later come to see again and again. The expression of someone who is evading thinking. I saw someone hit a wall in their own mind where they realized they'd been incontrovertibly, objectively, and unequivocally wrong. They had nowhere to go, but instead of adapting to new information, they pushed it away. With the evidence that he had demanded in hand, he looked me in the eye with a smile on his face and said, "We'll have to agree to disagree." This all occurred in moments, but I was taken aback at the sudden shift. In that moment, willful ignorance had been in the open, a physical expression, and I saw in his face myself every time that I had done the same thing. This is the first time I clearly understood that people do not change their minds based on evidence, but something else entirely. There never really has been two sides to this issue. Like so many other issues, there never was a controversy. There comes a point where an interlocutor's refusal to know is not an argument. It was always just one side using the tools of reason and methodology to reach conclusions, while the other was only claiming to be using those tools, but simultaneously rejecting them in action. That's how I learned that it didn't matter what type of knowledge someone was attempting to deny. There would be patterns to flawed methods of knowing. When people went wrong in their reasoning, it wasn't just about any specific issues they misunderstood. It was the bad techniques that they had used to reach those conclusions. The patterns in which people avoid knowledge offer a different perspective of history. It meant that history was often the result of what people avoided knowing, just as much as it was about what any society thought they had known at the time. It was bigger than any specific issue. Willful ignorance and false knowledge are tied to the roots of many of the core problems in our world today. A denial of knowledge or a rejection of knowledge is not an argument, but among the willfully ignorant, it will win every time. If all they have to do is put their fingers in their ears and yell, "Na na 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 boo boo," against anyone who questions them, there's not a force in the world that can stop them. You can't fight the dumb. There is no counter-argument against people who refuse to know things. A decade after this conversation, in the now, it's commonplace to hear people complain that their friends and neighbors have become fact-resistant. It's often described in political terms as if both sides were living in a different reality, and it's usually attributed to a split and polarized media environment. However, this narrative fails to account for the open embrace of anti-intellectualism and the disdain for the process of seeking out what's actually true. I describe it differently. For some groups, the ability to deny reality has become sacrosanct. For emotional and cultural reasons, they prize reality denial. It is possible to train people to become resistant to critical thinking. My friend made 2 + 2 = 5 in his mind. When you argue with someone trapped in the inversion, you're never arguing over any one single point of information. They haven't really based their beliefs on facts. They've involved themselves in the story, and their thoughts are more of a mass of feelings of the profound and the myths that reinforce them. The stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. Identity protective cognition. The anthropologists say that storytelling is at the center of being human. It's how we organize the world and our social situations. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are, where we come from, and where we're going define how we're supposed to think about the rest of the world. Stories are at the center of what distinguishes us from everybody else. They even define our own ideas about why we're special or why we matter. Identity is our place in the grander story of where we fit into our families, our tribes, our nations, or even the universe itself. We each have a version of ourselves that we hope and believe other people perceive us as. It's also how we use mental abstractions to try to live up to ideals that are bigger than ourselves. If I said, I am a man of my word, that is a story. It is a story that implies that I wish to be thought of not only as male, but as a distinct class of male who values commitments and truth as a badge of honor and a prerequisite for the title man. But what does it really mean, be a man? This is what we mean when we're talking about identity. Identity is the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves and the behavior we perform to try to justify that story. What must I do to uphold my status as a man? Different cultures and societies through time have had very different answers to those questions. Who we perceive ourselves to be, the identities we inherit from our cultures, are the scaffolding of the stories that guide our lives. Identity is a powerful force. Very few of us stop to consider how it affects our lives. Identity is dependent on others acknowledging us. Identity determines what type of community we have available when we need it. It determines material support and emotional acknowledgement that are vital for the physical and mental health of individuals. It defines who we are, but it also defines what sets aside outsiders and who they are. Our cultures, our families, our societies, they define the boundaries of identity. This is what it is to be a man, and this is what it is to be not man. To be a man and avoid not man, I must conform to others' ideas about what those things mean. Some types of identity we don't necessarily have a choice about. Where we're born or who our parents are, whether we're male or female, or whether we had darker skin or lighter skin, or even different hair color. Those types of identities are things people don't make choices about. Other types of identities are things people make active choices about. Someone who wishes to produce art might call themselves an artist. A person who plays a lot of video games might call themselves a gamer. People who are religious tend to identify with their religious group. Ideologies can serve as identities, whether somebody tells themselves they are a Republican or a Democrat or maybe a capitalist or a communist. Humans have found all sorts of ideas to incorporate into our identities. Sports, logos, brands, religions. We do this, they do that. We wear this, they wear that. We believe this, they believe that. The way we interact with one another is driven by these stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who they are. If a person invests themselves in a narrative, the slightest criticism of those ideas can be perceived as a personal attack. The opposite is that when a person's story of themselves is so self-flattering that they allow themselves to be seduced by irrational narratives. An individual's personal narrative is like a script for the boundaries of their behavior, but it's also how people fool themselves when reality doesn't match their expectations. When I was a conspiracy theorist, I would tell myself that even if some of my ideas were questionable, At least I wasn't as bad as the people who believed even more outlandish ideas. I was entertained by conspiracy media because other people were ready to believe ideas I considered to be outlandish, farcical, or utterly absurd. For me, it defined the boundaries of what was quote-unquote too far. At least, I didn't believe that lizard people ruled the world or that the planes that hit the towers were holograms. At least I was grounding my beliefs on something reasonable. At least, that's what I thought. In this way, we perceive ourselves and our own identity through other people. By watching media that reinforced my own conception of myself through the gullibility of others, I was stuck in a sort of self-congratulatory mode. At least I'm not as bad as those other people, I told myself. I wasn't weighing the actual evidence of any one point. I was avoiding taking responsibility for the lack of evidence I had to support my thinking by projecting that responsibility, for bad reason, onto other people. That's why we've got to talk about what science reveals about why people really enjoy reality TV. It's not good news. It turns out people enjoy trashy reality TV because we want to watch people who act in ways that are extreme, because we want to placate our own identity by telling ourselves, at least I'm not that bad. We justify our own beliefs by comparing them to others, and that is not a good way to justify what we believe is true. If we're asked to defend our beliefs and we feel like we're personally under attack, the mind wants to protect itself and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. If someone becomes uncomfortable with cognitive dissonance, if their personal story they tell themselves about reality feels threatened, one of the most immediate and easily available defense mechanisms is deflection and projection. Someone trapped in an inversion just turns it around and makes it about whoever is questioning their beliefs. This is why people trying to convince conspiracy theorists to practice genuine skepticism end up being accused of being gullible sheeple or even part of the conspiracy itself. Researchers have noted that people who tend towards conspiracy ideation strongly correlate with specific personality traits like narcissism, vanity, self-centeredness, egocentrism, distrustfulness, paranoia, insecurity, impulsivity, manipulativeness, and even deprived motivational needs. In the last several years, the concept of gaslighting has been popularized to describe when narcissistic people try to project accusations back upon their accusers. There's some misunderstanding about what gaslighting is. Gaslighting isn't just lying. This behavior isn't just limited to politics or personal relationships. It can be intentional, but it can be entirely subconscious to the people doing it. In an abusive relationship, an abuser will often lie to the victim, but the word gaslighting implies the lies have a desired outcome for the victim. They wish to reframe narratives in ways that place the victim at fault for failures and themselves as the good, correct, and reasonable people. Narcissists find ways of looking at everything in a way that puts responsibility on someone or something else for their own faults. If they cheat in the relationship, it wasn't their fault. It was their partner's failure for not being there or for failing to live up to their half of the relationship. Narcissists who gaslight attempt to project a complete distortion of reality for their victims. An abuser might say something like, "I'm sorry I hit you, but it's for your own good. I'm only trying to teach you to be better." Gaslighting is a type of projection that attempts to flip reality by framing it as if the one doing it has a better grasp on reality than the one being gaslit. I'm not crazy, you're crazy. I'm not uninformed, you're uninformed. One psychological trait that's often shown strong correlations with conspiracy belief is a need to feel special or distinctive from the rest of the group. They're susceptible to becoming convinced that they alone have access to knowledge that others do not. Individuals can be led to believe they possess unique knowledge and that outsiders either shouldn't have the knowledge because it's secret or sacred, or that the outsiders reject their special knowledge because the outsiders are the enemy. People who think along these lines often use a vocabulary that reflects a disdain for people who do not share their beliefs. Infidel, the sheeple, kafir, unbelievers, or heathens. There are a long list of the words that have been invented to describe people who don't share their special knowledge beliefs. This type of special knowledge is not gained through science, but by revelation. It was revealed to them because they are special, or they know someone who is special. They possess the special knowledge because they're smarter, wiser, or somehow better than other people. When someone's mental model of reality rests on defending a narrative central to the person's conception of themselves, it's easier to project infallibility than it is to question themselves, especially when someone believes they have access to special knowledge that others do not. Pseudo-intellectualism, wanting to be seen as smart. I have a cousin who loves to argue. He especially loves to argue with me about global warming. He constantly tells me that my experience in the classroom and the laboratory do not meet his standards, and that what I think I know about it is only brainwashing from the status quo. His answer to explain unusual weather patterns and increased heat? Well, how about them satellites and all that trash in space? You geniuses ever think of that? My cousin grew up in an environment where he learned that people who reject the status quo are edgy and interesting. In this way, he believes he can impress others by being a contrarian to perceived authorities, including me. I've been on the other side of that equation. I've been the person who didn't go to college and instead chose to work all the time. There's nothing wrong with choosing to work, but pretending to know more about the things than the people who have actually put in the effort to learn makes you look like a fool to anyone who actually does know that you're only pretending to know. The thing is, some people take pride in their lack of wealth or material possessions, and they find ways to bolster their sense of self-worth by adopting identities they are proud of, getting by on very little or nothing. Frugality, pragmatism, and mental discipline are arguably very good things, and it makes sense that these virtues can often be synonymous with spirituality and mental identity. However, applying the same framework to the possession of knowledge or experience inevitably means that those who do not possess knowledge can come to view their own lack of experience as a unique insight into how the world works. They begin to view their ignorance as a matter of pride. In their mind, being an intellectual means questioning the status quo. This is the inversion. Anti-intellectual individuals and contrarians can only be right by way of the status quo being wrong. They attempt to present their case using the words and methodologies of the intellectual world, but they often outright reject the knowledge already gained from it. In my cousin's understanding of who he is and where he fits into the world, the network of ideas in his mind is pure and free of bias because he hasn't been indoctrinated with ideology from a formal education. When I tell him that I am certain that the chemistry of the air has something to do with the amount of heat that it can absorb from sunlight and how long that it can hold on to it, in his mind, he thinks I only believe this because it was written in a book given to me by people with an agenda. My cousin does not know the stories of the people who did the work to gain that knowledge. None of that history is available in his mind. He's never had to perform their experiments to duplicate their findings. He has no access to the type of direct experience that teaches somebody the unbreakable nature of physical laws. When I tell him that's how I can say I'm certain, He'll then tell me that I am intellectually dishonest for being certain. Instead, the only way he can argue with me is to pretend that his absence of knowledge and subsequent refusal to honestly investigate are equally valid when it comes to answering the question. My cousin ends every conversation on the topic with a clever statement he's heard somewhere else. He usually seems convinced that he's won the argument afterward, too. He'll say this common colloquial phrase, "It is what it is," and wave his hand dismissively. These types of phrases serve as social cues that imply I should stop talking about it and that the topic should now be considered taboo. The phrase, "it is what it is similar to the Game of Thrones reference I made in the previous episode about the Dothraki people saying, "it is known," to signal that you should drop it. These types of phrases are called thought-terminating clichés. They serve as mental shortcuts to shut down critical thinking and complex analysis. They help to assuage cognitive dissonance by providing a quick and easy off-ramp to the burden of thinking. It's no coincidence that the same type of mental shortcuts are used by cult leaders to control their followers. They are subtle thought structures that demand obedience to an individual or group over reason. Thought-terminating clichés are a language used to sabotage higher-order thinking. We learn thought-terminating clichés through our social groups, our cultures, and the types of media that we interact with. An excellent example of a complex thought-terminating cliché that goes beyond just words is the idea of hell. Believers are often taught that they will be sent to hell if they have any serious doubts, even for a moment. Hell is a consequence of thought crime. Each person has a very different version of what they think of the word hell might actually imply, but generally, most people agree that it would be a horrifyingly miserable experience of torture and suffering. The threat of being sent there for even a momentary infraction of doubt is an extremely powerful emotional impulse. It's one that repeated exposure creates subconscious mental aversions to specific ideas. A pattern of thinking like this is also an example of a learned mental shortcut called a heuristic. Mental shortcuts are not bad on their own, but if we're not aware that we're being exposed to them, they can obscure our ability to analyze complex topics. That is why intentionally created heuristics are particularly powerful. Disinformation specialists are very good at manufacturing heuristics that prime their audiences to be resistant to attempts to provide counter-evidence or unpack beliefs. Audiences can be primed over time by exposure to heuristics not meant to convince of a specific talking point, but to create a much broader type of abstraction. You could call it a vibe. The next time you hear somebody make the argument that we shouldn't worry about climate change because the climate has always been changing, that's a manufactured heuristic. It was bought and paid for, and they got what they paid for with people mindlessly repeating it. When people willingly submit to heuristics in this way, they reduce the complexity of issues into simple, safe, and comfortable formats that can be easily dismissed or ignored entirely. Conveniently, for researchers at least, many of these types of repetition buzzword heuristics are traceable back to their source of origin. Mass disinformation and how the public debate for truth can become dishonest. When people have turned their minds into a walking billboard for somebody else's thought avoidance, the argument is never about a single point of information. It doesn't work to debunk specific facts because most heuristics are very general and abstract to begin with. Specialists in rhetoric and propaganda understand this concept and use it to their advantage. A very good example that transcends national boundaries and time is the phrase, "support our troops." Rhetorically, there is no simplistic counter-argument to this generic phrase. Someone could specifically give the counter-argument that they do support the troops, but they don't support the current war. But that argument of the specific against the very generalized idea that we should always support the troops, and antithetically, whoever doesn't support the troops must support the enemy. Support our troops is an example of simple wording that can be used to discourage complex thinking or complex counter-arguments before they even arise. In this way, propagandists build up heuristics over time by reinforcing them via different media. Propagandists use similar thinking shortcuts by exploiting hyperbole. One of the most direct examples of this is the often repeated claim that the Black Lives Matter movement, quote-unquote, burned our cities to the ground. There are no cities that burned to the ground. Some buildings were burned and vandalized, but no cities burned. The statement is an obvious exaggeration, but one that's openly accepted and repeated as if it were a fact. It's a statement about something very specific, and when questioned, it reverts to a general vibe. The people making the claim felt that their cities were under attack, so they feel completely justified to use hyperbole when describing it. Often the same people are unwilling to accept any hyperbole used by anyone else outside of their accepted nation or tribal social identity, especially a perceived enemy. What's most telling about these types of heuristics is that while one side of the argument is stretching hyperbole beyond its boundaries, it simultaneously denies outright facts by intentionally mistaking them for hyperbole when they come from someone outside of their in-group. When my preacher friend had complained about the Big Bang Theory, he told me that scientists claimed everything came from nothing. I explained that really that was just an expression. It was just hyperbole. It was an exaggeration so that the meaning of what someone is trying to say is clearer to an audience. As a hyperbole compared to everything that now exists, yes, everything came from nothing. But that's really just an exaggeration to explain how the expansion of the universe came from a crazy, super infinitely tiny spot. It's not meant to be taken literally. The preacher's response was that science communicators and scientists should never use hyperbole because it's misleading for audiences. The rules apply to thee, but not me. There's something consistent with the types of black and white thinking of people blind to their own hypocrisy. There's always a need to control the conversation from a condescending narrative that dictates what's allowed to be true and what isn't, and what counts as hyperbole and what doesn't. The ones doing this have a need to project a type of performance as if they were superior to whoever is questioning them. It's a projection that they are in control of how the conversation is had and how it is allowed to end. It's important to understand that the mind wants to find a balance where it can reconcile with itself. None of us really wants to be perceived as bad or dumb. We want to believe that we're in the right. We want to believe that we're the ones with the truth. It feels that way for everybody. However, sometimes to get there, it requires that meaning itself be inverted or flipped. George Orwell described this as doublethink. Psychologists and social scientists have a similar word called cognitive dissonance. Others have described it as anti-intellectual syncretism. It's where we do mental gymnastics to blend incompatible and opposing ideas together. We create shortcut heuristics that eliminate nuance and avoid contradictions. I call this the inversion because when you deal with someone who believes in objectively untrue things, they're not actually defending what they believe. They're defending their own conception of self. The inversion is the interior world of knowledge available to a believer. It's a network of beliefs about how the world works and how they fit into it. Conspiracy ideation is not isolated. It shares the same cognitive spaces with other ideas about how we understand reality and how we relate to it. Obvious examples are relationships to authority, to governments, other social groups, even larger existential relationships like life beyond Earth, spirits, an afterlife, or even gods. The point of understanding what I call the inversion is to try to explain that when we're talking about beliefs, conspiracy theories are not alone. They exist alongside whole other structures of knowledge, cultural influences, and specific ways of thinking that can form an individual's worldview. When complexity and nuance are denied, it's almost always to support an inversion of facts for someone who is defending a personal belief over reason. When someone says, the mainstream scientists are being closed-minded for not accepting evidence of telekinesis, crystal healing, and psychic powers. When a young Earth creationist insists, we're the ones using science, not the secular scientist. Conspiracy theorists will say, if you disagree with me, it's because you're a part of the cover-up, or you're so dumb you fall for the cover-up. In psychology, this technique has been referred to by the acronym DARVO: deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. When people deny the nuances of history, they are intentionally reducing the complexity of history into format they find less unpleasant. For example, many modern conservatives in the US reject or deny the ongoing realignment of their party in previous decades, known to historians and political scientists as the Southern Strategy. By directly denying the complexity and nuance of history, these narratives attempt to invert meaning through revisionism and will often take credit for people, movements, or events in an attempt to establish legitimacy. They will insist that because Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves and Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, the modern Republican Party are paragons of racial justice and equality. While reducing the complexity of history, they will insist that parties and ideologies have remained consistent for 150 years, while directly avoiding the recent history of their party's realignment. Narratives like this that use projection to invert meaning are commonly employed to deny the root causes of the American Civil War. This kind of denial is not isolated to the United States. Many movements co-opt historical figures and claim that they would have been on their side. When narratives reduce the causes of wars to singular grievances and agendas, when they have a need to portray themselves as the good guys and someone else as the bad guys, this is the inversion. When someone makes the argument that they're not racist for doing racist things, that you're the real racist for pointing it out, this is the inversion. When someone says climate change isn't real, the poles are reversing, it's just science, this is the inversion. All sides of an argument dispute that they're the ones coming to the correct conclusion based on evidence, even if it's actually quite the opposite. This projection, this reversal of meaning, is the end product of doublethink. You could think of it like an accusation in a mirror. I call it the inversion. This is how someone can claim to be for small government, but clearly support a large and overbearing government. This is how real news is labeled as fake news. This is how free speech absolutists claim they're defending freedom of speech while supporting legal action against those who disagree with them. If you've ever heard of what they call Trump derangement syndrome, TDS, this is an excellent example of the inversion. Trump supporters use this word to describe people whose political focus is only Trump, to an absurd degree bordering on obsession. The accusation primes Trump supporters to accuse any opposition to Trump of being mentally deranged. It's a reframing of reality that prevents any accusation of oddball behavior that could be used to describe some of Trump's own obsessive cult-like followers. This is how a political movement can claim to be a populist movement, but still benefit and be supported by the old regime. The ultra-rich have always supported and endorsed Trump. This is how mass manipulation can convince people that feeling right is more important than anything else, including truth, common decency, prosperity, or even self-preservation. Some have said that it is opposite world. They've called it hypocritical. It's been called the Twilight Zone. And it's been said that people have been propagandized, brainwashed, and lost between hyperbole. I call it the inversion because it is ideological subversion, and the people living in it are trapped in a flipped cognitive reality. They've been convinced that they have the right to strong-arm reality into conforming to their opinions. Cultures that use inversion narratives prime their followers to marginalize outsiders as hostile and stupid. As a result, inversion narratives are almost always adversarial. The inversion effect is how entire groups of people can be trained up over time through repetition and Pavlovian techniques. It teaches people to accept anecdotal stories and feel-good lies as evidence. When they deny nuance, they're not only denying nuance on any one issue, they're also advocating for a practice of denying nuance altogether. Over time, it can diminish the impulse and ability for critical evaluation. It convinces liars of their own self-righteousness. It is a bending of hyperbole, where every statement can be a lie. The inversion is the weaponization of the mind in defense of false knowledge. The point of grounding our project in the inversion is establishing that the people who misuse words of power, science, and logic are using the same vocabulary, but operating with wildly different definitions of what those words actually mean in practice. It is important to understand the flipped nature of reality for someone who's under a delusion, not to share in the delusion, but to understand why they're trapped in it. To a conspiracy-minded person, anyone who disagrees with them is part of the conspiracy as a participant or as a blind sheep. This is why close friends and family are so much more successful in reasoning people out of unreason. We're all far more likely to listen to people we trust than people we've already written off as untrustworthy or stupid. Cults attempt to isolate their followers from outside influences for this exact reason. Close friends and familiar bonds can offer a bridge back to a world outside of the inversion. When I was a conspiracy theorist, it was only after I'd lost friends and driven away loved ones that I began to question myself. It was a hard reckoning, and that's also how I learned there's no polite way to tell yourself that you've been manipulated. The preacher's final lesson. When I grew up, my family always liked to argue. We had exciting debates and argued about who was right about facts. I grew up believing most people who argued cared about what was true. I think a lot of people make that positive assumption that other people genuinely desire to know what's true and what isn't. I've known a lot of smart people who believe most people want to live in a world of reason and justice. So when we encounter so many people who are wrong about objective facts, we assume that the majority of people are just accidentally misinformed. However, there is a devastating coming-of-age moment when we discover that many people do not actually care about what the facts are. I didn't understand it at the time, but the preacher who was my friend taught me that social pressure and identity are incredibly powerful forces. It can feel like we are betraying ourselves or our group by being forced to acknowledge counter-truths. For him, admitting that he was wrong would have been an existential threat to his identity, his home, his connection to his family, and his livelihood. That terror of self-annihilation is like a subconscious wall. If we let it, that egocentric attachment to identity can prevent us from seeing what's true. In that way, self-deception is like a prison the mind chooses for us. This type of indoctrination is so deep that even educated people feel like they're being objective. He taught me that false knowledge blocks our access to real knowledge. Knowledge denial is a dead-end street that simulates self-liberation, but it makes any other way of thinking impossible. You'll never know those things beyond what you refuse to know. As the philosopher Johann Goethe said, none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe that they are free. A true teacher is someone who empowers someone to become their own teacher. The preacher taught me to appreciate Galileo's wisdom when Galileo said, "I have never met a man so ignorant that I couldn't learn from him." Because an inversion is not a specific set of beliefs, but an overlying ecosystem of ontology that attempts to a priori negate any other way of thinking, a compromised mind is one that doesn't have a method of thought. Instead, it operates purely on instinctual emotion under a comforting veneer of justified. They don't know that they don't know, but crucially, without a method, they don't know how they would know in the first place. Those who are trapped by it are often unable to even consider a charitable interpretation of whoever they're arguing against. They're sometimes so dedicated to proving their enemies wrong that they fail to provide any evidence whatsoever for why they are right. During a debate, if questioned hard enough, instead of contemplating the possibility that they could be wrong about an idea or some evidence, they'd rather argue towards a type of nihilism of knowledge where words have no discernible meaning and history will forever remain mystical and unknowable. It isn't new. In ancient Greece, Socrates described this type of incurious behavior as amathia. Amathia isn't just ignorance, it is a corrupt lack of learning. It is anti-wisdom. It is belief without understanding by those who should know better. Socrates describes those who are guilty of this as being self-righteous, arrogant, prideful, but critically that amathia was a corruption of the spirit. The philosopher and political historian Hannah Arendt said that the sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. She said the essence of evil is its refusal to think. When we agree to disagree with those who would evade knowledge, the rules of engagement are determined by whoever is the most unethical. It's like agreeing to be on the losing end of an abusive relationship. They force anyone engaging with them to cater to their ignorance. It sets up a paradigm where reality must always take a back seat to the whims of a childish mind. Over time, this steady retreat undermines the concept of truth. For every time that we agree to disagree about facts with people who explicitly ignore knowledge, we make knowledge denial a common social practice. A society that evades knowledge will eventually grow numb to lies and resistant to truth. I ask you, what would it look like for the wealthy and influential to build a political movement or even a culture that suited their interest? It might look like blind support and a blind eye, anti-empathy, idealism over reality, and anti-intellectualism could be manufactured with the timed insertion of the right stimulus. These types of worlds are the fictional dystopias that so many people in our social and political culture have tried to warn us about. There's really no scenario where people who don't want you to think about something are your friends. There exists a science of engineering ignorance, and while its methods are not novel, the technological changes our societies are now undergoing allow the process to become self-serving and fully automated. The general public does not seem to be aware of what is happening, and more important, they don't seem to be aware that they are unaware. If the brainwashing from sci-fi dystopias ever existed in the real world, this is how it would appear. Orwell was onto something when he explained the twisted logic behind those who can convince themselves that 2 + 2 = 5. But perhaps even more presciently, the dystopian author Aldous Huxley predicted that society could become dehumanized by coming to love their oppression and adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. We live in an inverted world where ignorance has been weaponized. This is the dystopia people have feared for so long, and this was no accident. What is not true has a distinct advantage over what is true. The truth can only be one thing, where what is not true is unlimited. Truth is also rare compared to the abundance of every possible untruth. It is therefore the nature of knowledge that a disproportionate amount of effort is required to sort truth from fiction. If you're looking for a needle in a haystack, you might have to sort through a lot of hay. However, one thing is certain. Truth is not going to be found with people who specialize in how to avoid it. Someone who can convince themselves that it's a moral good to lie for Jesus is capable of justifying far worse things. And that is why I am no longer friends with the young earth creationist preacher, because that's exactly what Voltaire meant when he said, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." I cannot agree to disagree with those who would evade available knowledge of what they are disagreeing with. When someone who evades knowledge of something but simultaneously demands their opinion on the matter be held in equal regard to those who have done the work to gain comprehension, it's not just insulting, it's a moral failure by those eager to outsource their thinking to someone else. Isaac Asimov once wrote, "There is a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there always has been. The strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge." There are people full of reactionary rage at engineered falsehoods, while open dishonesty has become the tolerated social norm. For many of us, there is a decision between which principle is more important than the other: coerced, forced civility, or truth and justice. The preacher taught me that the future was full of existential problems that required an informed public if there was to be any future at all. I decided that becoming a grade school teacher wasn't good enough. I decided that I needed to empower other people with my mistakes so that they could become their own teachers. I want to encourage my listeners to take pity on those affected by an inversion. When you're trapped in such a mental rut, it requires near superhuman persistence to even discover you're in the rut. I hope that you'll be heartened to know that although false knowledge and social norms may be dominant in a culture, they're often frail and break under a modicum of honest investigation. Falsehoods require constant effort to maintain. In the long run, they're fragile and futile against a genuinely curious mind. The primitive parts of our minds fall into traps too easily, but there is a future where we find our way past this problem. In the next episode, I'll discuss the red pill manosphere, and I'll talk about the role identity plays in shaping narratives, and how those narratives can be manipulated to create markets for products and ideas. We'll talk about the theory of reflexive control and how mass manipulation has been modeled and quantified in the modern era to maximize profits and influence events. If you like what I do here, consider contributing to my coffee and book addiction at www.gofundme.com/u/Nobody Knows Nothing podcast. The podcast is on YouTube and Spotify. Don't forget to subscribe or follow. Any comments, thumbs up, or likes help out a lot. Thank you to anyone who is listening.